Okay, I think we're ready to get started. I want to thank everybody for coming or for listening in. I want to thank our panelists who have called in. Senator Derek Kitchen, County Council Member Shireen Ghorbani. My name is Bill Tibbetts. I'm the Associate Director at Crossroads Urban Center. And Crossroads has been helping low-income families with food and clothing since 1966. And hey, there's City Council Member Chris Wharton.
Hi.
Welcome.
Sorry I'm late.
You're barely late. I was just saying, so Crossroads has been serving low-income families with food and clothing since 1966. Throughout our history, we've also done advocacy on policy issues that impact the people that we serve. Throughout our history, it's also been true that a large percentage of the people we serve are homeless. I was thinking this morning about how when I started working at Crossroads Urban Center in 2001, there was a group of, 20 to 30 men who would come to our food pantry every single morning, and they would either use the restroom or use the phone. Sometimes we'd help them with food, and they lived on the street, or sometimes they'd be at the shelter. Normally they lived on the street, and if you talk to them, a lot of them would tell you that that's where they wanted to be. And the interesting thing was, in 2004, 2005, people at the state and federal level started talking about creating a 10-year plan to reduce chronic homelessness. Utah got very excited about this, built a couple hundred units of permanent supportive housing. And the amazing thing is that a lot of the people who I saw every day stopped coming in. Some of them stopped coming in at all. We saw an instant decline in the number of people staying in shelters, the number of people sleeping on the streets. We got national attention for being a leader on how to address homelessness. But then a recession began in 2009, and we stopped building supportive housing like the units we'd built during the years before then, and really didn't start building another project for about 10 years. And so the reason that Crossroads Urban Center is organizing this series of conversations about housing and homelessness is that we want to avoid that happening again. We don't want to have another 10 years where homelessness and housing affordability get neglected. And so we're lucky, we have people from city government, county government, state government, and we're going to talk about what state and local government can do to address homelessness and housing affordability, long-term problems during a recession when there's not a lot of money available. So I think we will start with City Council Member Chris Wharton, because Salt Lake City has actually done some amazing work in terms of addressing homelessness, addressing housing affordability. And one of the things that we think can be done to address homelessness and housing affordability is using government-owned property because if you don't have cash, you can have property, and you can forego revenue on the sale of that property some future year by putting it to use now, which actually puts people to work during a recession, but it also helps us address a long-term need during a time when we don't have the cash to do so. So I've invited Council Member Wharton to talk about what Salt Lake City is doing and their experience in using publicly owned land, publicly owned properties to spur the development of affordable housing, particularly housing that reduces homelessness.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'm always love to talk about Salt Lake City and the exciting and innovative things that we're doing. In housing last year, the redevelopment agency leveraged $26 million to raise in RDA dollars to raise $231 million in private dollars for housing. So this will result in more than 800 housing units, over half of which, 490, will be designated as affordable. And the level of affordability for those varies from 25% of AMI or less to 80% of AMI. And we've also, for a long time, have used city property to do land write-downs, which is essentially an in-kind contribution to developers who are willing to build affordable housing projects. We've also bought specific properties in Salt Lake City, like the Overnighter Hotel on North Temple, to spur development of higher quality affordable units. In that case, we hope to have 89 units that will be for 60% or below AMI, and encourage also private redevelopment in that area. So that's sort of an overview of what we've been able to do in the last couple of years. There are other examples too, the Magnolia Project, which I'll go into more detail later on with one of your questions. So yeah, we've had a lot of success being able to do exactly the strategy that you're talking about.
Great. Thank you for that, for talking about it. Salt Lake City has done some amazing work, and I think what's exciting is that two of the people who helped get that work started are now the mayor of the city and current council chair, and then also a member of the state senate who happens to be part of this conversation. So, which means that there's hopefully potential for partnering better with the state. I was hoping that I know in Salt Lake County last year they did an extensive analysis of which properties were owned by the government, different government entities in the county. And so I was wondering, I was hoping that County Council member Shireen Ghorbani could talk about the possibility of using some of that property to promote affordable housing or other things that are happening in the county.
Forgot to unmute myself there. Yes, thank you so much for bringing this panel together. I have to take a moment to just talk a little bit about sort of my passion for this issue, but also to acknowledge that I think in the time of the pandemic, we have seen further laid bare many of the issues around housing insecurity that were right below the surface in our community. And I'm very concerned about what the next year, the next even few months are going to look like. Very concerned about a looming foreclosure crisis, very, very concerned about an eviction crisis on the horizon. I was just pulling out my notes. Some national reporting came out yesterday suggesting that nearly 30% of renters in Utah could be in real trouble here in the short term. So many of these issues really kind of layer onto something that I know others on this call, and certainly you, Bill, and your advocacy have been working on for many years in our community, which is a real understanding of the depth of the problem of housing insecurity and what solutions need to be part of that. The way that you started talking about the permanent supportive housing is something I'm very passionate about and a little more closely connected to with some of the committees that I have been attending and sit on at the county, looking specifically at work that's been done through some of the criminal justice reform work to really figure out how we're going to create sober living opportunities, even ongoing long-term treatment, tied to housing. And all of that we know is so important to people gaining some stability as they're moving out of often, highly unstable or even in some cases chronic homelessness. One of the things that, so you had mentioned the opportunity, and I know that Councilmember Wharton just talked about this as well, but the opportunity that we have to look at the inventory across this whole county and to think really strategically about where there might be an opportunity to leverage some public, some of the county-owned property, certainly cities can be a part of this as well, to look at where we might find opportunities that are on good transit lines, where we can have a diversity of housing kinds of options, whether it's single family homes, but certainly also more supportive living environments. And that when we're doing that work, it's important to me that we're also thinking about access, accessibility, and all of those kinds of layers around what makes a healthy community: access to food, access to grocery stores, access to opportunity. So I know that's something that is a conversation that's happening at the county. It's an issue that I personally am very passionate about. And I think that we should take this opportunity, as we're seeing, as I mentioned at the top of my comments, just the realities that are being laid bare by this pandemic. I think we should use that as an indication of how we prioritize housing in these next years.
Hey, I wanted to thank you for mentioning housing for people coming out of recovery, because I think actually, that is a part of the conversation that often gets ignored. I think it's interesting because I know people who work in the area of, in the criminal justice area, and they will say that one of the big unfortunate things about our time is that the number one service provider for people with mental illness on any given night is the jail. And then if you think about the number of people who were released from the jail or released from the state hospital or released from the hospital to a homeless shelter or to someplace on the street, it's actually very alarming. And so I think it's really important to think about populations that can be helped. I think for us here at Crossroads, we're very concerned about children who are homeless right now. There are over 100 people and families with kids who've been in our shelter in Midvale and in Salt Lake County for over 9 months. And there are other kids who've been homeless, been to the shelter over 4 times in the past 2 years. And so I think it's really important, if we're going to develop properties, if we're going to promote things, that we think about where can we have an impact, where can we actually reach our different longer term goals. Our third panelist today is Senator Derek Kitchen, who, as I said earlier, was a driving force in moving Salt Lake City toward doing more in housing when he was on the city council, and now he's a state senator, and he's actually sponsored housing bills. And so he is somebody who has a demonstrated commitment to housing and to improving housing and affordability. And we're really pleased that he's able to talk with us today.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that generous introduction. And I want to thank both Councilwoman Shireen Ghorbani and Councilmember Chris Wharton from the city for being here today. I know that both of you individually as elected officials have also demonstrated your commitment to housing. Am I breaking up? Okay, I'm okay. And I just wanted to appreciate my time sitting here with all of you today, and Bill in particular with you in Crossroads. Before we began this conversation today, you and I were chatting a little bit offline about the long-standing commitment of Crossroads and your focus on housing. And I would argue that part of the reason over the last couple of decades, part of the reason why Salt Lake City as a municipality has been so progressive and thoughtful on housing is because of the political capital and sort of the community organizing that Crossroads has done on this issue in particular. So thank you for your work on that. I've been feeling a little anxious the last couple of weeks. Well, I've been feeling anxious this whole year generally, but on housing in particular over the last couple of weeks as we approach the end of the federal assistance on unemployment insurance. And I've been having some flashback trauma to 2007, 2008, as we approached the mortgage crisis that led ultimately to the Great Recession. And I'm quite worried that we are standing on the cliff of something very similar right now, for different reasons, but primarily due to the fact that we're seeing, we're staring down the barrel of a number of evictions nationwide, and Utah will not be immune from the broad economic consequences that our country and our world are facing right now. And so I really worry about people who've never necessarily been living on the street or been, living, without homes, facing a reality of being homeless themselves for the first time ever. And so there's some real concerns that I think our community are going to have to address in the near future here, beyond the existing homelessness and housing and affordability issues that our community is facing. As you all know, that we've been seeing a rising in housing affordability over the last couple of decades here in Utah. And with our massive population growth and the projected doubling of our population over the next couple of decades, I imagine that we're going to see some compounding issues with affordability in our community, and more folks priced out of the communities where they live in right now. I'm glad that you brought up the issue of children in shelters, because we were talking a lot about schooling right now, and how do we safely open up our schools and make for a healthy environment for our youth and for our children in our community. And I think it's just important to note that a homeless shelter is no place for a child to be raised. And so our focus on housing and getting families stable has to be the very, very top of that list when we're talking about housing and housing affordability in our community. Permanent supportive housing is something that we've been talking about at the city level for many, many years. And Salt Lake City really has put its money where its mouth is when talking about supportive services and housing that really allows people to get from living in the streets and all of the services and help that they need to become stable for the long haul. And the problem here ultimately comes down to resources, financial resources. Because when we're talking about permanent supportive housing, housing is expensive to develop. And when you're talking about services, services cost ongoing money. And then the fact that it's permanent makes it that much more expensive. So I think, we just need to, as a community, as a statewide community, we really have to make the commitment to invest in permanent supportive housing for the long haul. And like I said earlier, Salt Lake City has really made that commitment. I think the county has done an excellent.
Oh no, he did freeze.
Yeah, it's.
Can I?
Go ahead.
I felt like maybe he was unfreezing there for a second. But one of the things that, back, you froze there for a second.
I'm sorry, I have an unstable internet connection, so my apologies there.
So basically where you left off was talking about, that these are ongoing costs, and I just wanted to add it, and hopefully we can kind of hear the rest of what you were saying there. I think we also have to be very realistic about the real and very high costs of continuing to cycle people through shelters, through not in all cases, but in some cases, our emergency services, whether that's ER or into our jail, and really talking about the investment that is made in these kinds of supportive housing environments is a lower overall cost. I think it's a moral issue. I think that we should put people in housing for those reasons, but I think there's also a strong economic case to be made. It's a better investment of our dollars to create stability in these for these families and for these individuals. And I think that can get lost when we talk about how expensive it is to buy, to build and buy housing and to put the supportive systems around that. So not that you were saying that, I just think that's an important point to also elevate in this conversation.
Well, and I actually think it's a great time for talking about it, because one of the things that we have to have learned from this pandemic is that housing is a lot better than a shelter for keeping people safe, because we had to close down 2 of our homeless shelters in Salt Lake County because there were outbreaks of the pandemic. And, you know, I think it makes, you know, people who do the type of work I do often talk about housing as healthcare. I think one thing that the legislature did right was they instructed the Department of Health to apply for a waiver to make various housing-related services eligible, part of what we do with our Medicaid program in the state. A lot of states haven't done that, so we are moving toward integrating homeless services with health services, with behavioral health services, mental health services. We aren't there, but we're moving in that way. And I think that if there's one thing our state should get from this pandemic is a drive to move that way faster, because it was clear before the pandemic that that's where we needed to go. I think now there should be a bigger sense of urgency about getting there.
Well, I think just to pick up on what you're saying, Bill, but also what Council Member Ghorbani was getting at with regard to the cost. And, you know, we sometimes talk about the big flashy dollar signs above the development of a project, or, you know, a new homeless facility, or you know, services themselves. But outcomes are really the ultimate thing that we're going for here. And we know what to do. We know where investments are working well. And it comes down to services. And, you know, the county jail is not the best place for people to be receiving the kind of services that, you know, it happens to be where we're putting a lot of our resources, but we need to be getting out ahead of these things from a generational standpoint and talking about housing as healthcare, like you mentioned, getting people stabilized. Because one thing that Salt Lake City learned through the Housing First initiative is that when you get people in a home, stabilized under a roof, so many things fall naturally into place. When you have an address, it's a lot easier to apply for that driver's license that you lost. When you have an address, it's a lot easier to apply for state benefits that you probably already qualify for. When you have an address that's permanent and stable, you'd be surprised how many of your family members and community members sort of come back to create that natural supportive environment that allow people to thrive. So housing as healthcare is definitely a way of talking about it, but it's so much more than that. And so if we could get out in front of a lot of these issues, especially like I mentioned at the generational level, and think about the impact to children and youth when they're cycling in and out of a facility, when their parents are cycling in and out of the county jail. This is doing real long-term damage and trauma to a lot of, you know, members of our community. And I think that we have to really start talking about housing as a priority for all healthcare needs.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I would say I'm glad you brought the conversation back to children, because I think if there's one thing we would really like to see the city, the county, the state figure out how to do is to build, to figure out what kind of supportive housing is needed for families, particularly the ones that are cycling in and out of homelessness repeatedly, or have been in the shelter for 6 months, 9 months, because I think that is a problem that we can't afford to wait 10 years until the economy's back to where it was before the pandemic began to address. I think that's something, the long-term consequences of letting children go through the trauma of long-term homelessness, I mean, means that they're more likely to be held back, not just 1 grade, but 2 grades, more likely to have behavioral health problems. And so, like, that's, we just, like, we can't afford to wait, you know, until things are better to start finding solutions for addressing homelessness. Or for addressing child homelessness. One question I wanted to ask you, there's an idea that the president of Zion's Bank, of all people, Scott Anderson, proposed in an op-ed about 2 weeks ago, that the state should look at the example of some other states where they've issued 100-year bonds to address long-term needs during this recession, because, you know, we need, during the recession, people need jobs, and our long-term needs don't get better by being neglected. And so he actually specifically mentioned bonding, including funding for affordable housing in this bond. I was curious, I mean, do you think that there could be any appetite for doing that in the legislature this year, Senator?
You know, I'm always surprised by the Utah legislature. I'll just put that out there first. But yeah, you know, we have enormous capacity as a state from, you know, bonding capacity. We can, you know, pull about $2 billion or so right now from our capacity, and we have historically low interest rates in this country. You know, hovering around 1% on a community bond. It doesn't get any cheaper than that for us. So I think that if we're going to be looking down the barrel of a crisis, and we know we've got growth coming, and we truly care about long-term outcomes of the residents of this state when it comes to emotional, behavioral, social welfare, housing has really got to be where we put our focus. And I think that there's a real opportunity to talk about housing in infrastructure terms. You know, housing is just as important infrastructure as our school systems, as our highways, you know, as the network that brings us our goods and our services and our groceries. So I think that when we talk about the opportunity to bond, you know, to keep the economy going, to put, you know, to put Utahns back to work, and to just keep things working, why not? You know, spend the resources on keeping Utahns working to keep their livelihoods going, but also to think about the long-term needs of our community as we grow. And it doesn't, nothing is more important right now than housing. And so I would definitely encourage the Utah legislature, and have been talking about it with my Republican and Democratic colleagues. And so just to get to the meat of your question, I do believe that there's appetite to include housing in a larger bonding discussion. Now, I think it's going to come down to the political pressure. You know, so we need to get Utahns, anybody who's watching this Facebook Live or is engaged in housing, we need to make sure that we are really building the pressure politically, because I do believe that if we could, you know, we're this close to getting almost every legislator to agree that housing is a priority. So we just need to, we're almost at that tipping point, not quite there yet, but we're getting there. And so we just got to keep building this conversation. But that's a long-winded answer, but I do believe that the appetite is there. You see folks like Scott Anderson and others really, you know, talking about strategic ways to do this. Now, it was mentioned a moment ago about all the work that Salt Lake County has done on inventorying and understanding what the, you know, what public property is owned, what is owned by the general public, and what is being utilized for, you know, something that the county needs, and what isn't being utilized. And so those conversations are ongoing, but this is the conversation that we need to be doing at the state level as well. So I think about, you know, what makes housing expensive, right? There's three main components: the cost of land, the cost of labor, and the cost of materials. Okay. Now, the cost of materials, we can do something there, but it's a little bit trickier. If we can get out ahead with, you know, focusing on cost of labor and cost of land, if the county and the state can take their unutilized property and use that to leverage the development of affordable housing, you're currently writing off the cost of housing right there, because we already have that in our hands. So we're not worried about the cost of land there, right? So if you can get rid of the cost of land, you can bond at historically low interest rates to pay for things like labor and materials. All of a sudden you sort of have, it's not a silver bullet, but it's definitely a magic bullet, right? And it's an opportunity for us to really talk about infusing a lot of housing units into the inventory. And at the end of the day, in our unique circumstance here in Utah, it's got to come down to increasing housing supply. And then of course, permanent supportive housing has some nuance there, but we've got to pump units into the market here. And this is one creative way of doing that. And I think bonding is a way that we should talk about paying for that.
That's right. I think bonding is important, but I would also point to, you know, the state had already made commitments as part of the what started as Operation Rio Grande and then went to Operation Diversion, about trying to, as part of Salt Lake City taking on hosting 3 of the homeless shelters in the state, a bigger percentage coming to us for affordable housing from the state. And unfortunately, we saw a big reduction in that in the last legislative session. I mean, that was a commitment that was already made, that is part of a long ongoing effort. And if the public sort of allows state leaders to forget about those commitments that we made or that the state made, then that continues to put us in a position where we're, again, instead of being proactive, we're just making up for more lost ground. And so it has to be a long, ongoing, sustained effort from not only advocates like yourself and organizations like Crossroads, but from the public as well, and to understand that yes, COVID-19 sort of changed everything for everybody, but taking away housing dollars in a time like this is the opposite of what we should be doing. So there's so much that Salt Lake City could have done with that money, especially at this time. And because we didn't get it, and it was money that was already sort of planned for as part of the dispersing the shelters and having a decentralized model, like we're already taking steps backwards, I'm afraid.
And I would just like to kind of zoom out for a second on this issue too. I'm obviously, and we're all elected in Salt Lake County, but my first experience in Utah politics was the honor of running in the 2nd Congressional District. And I was just looking back at some of the notes that I had. I think when we're thinking about the housing challenges and the looming potential crisis that's coming, we have to acknowledge, and Senator Kitchen mentioned this too, that we were already in a crisis in terms of the number of units that we have in our state. And it's certainly an issue I think about a lot in the context of Salt Lake County. But I remember conversations that I had in places like St. George and Milford, Utah, of all places, right, where we have a shortage of affordable housing. So we're talking about two different things, kind of same issue, right? The individuals in our community that really need truly deeply affordable housing. So that's where we're talking about, permanent supportive housing, a stock that can come in, a stock of housing that can come in and address really like people living in a situation where, that first home loan is distant, something on the distance that we would love to see people attain, but like is probably not a reality in the short term here. But we have a lot of people, and I found this knocking on doors across this state. We have a lot of people living intergenerationally because they are unable to find housing that's affordable. So I think we have to be creative as we're thinking about this too, and the opportunity to create lots of different kinds of housing and a stock that is within reach. And when that happens, I think that's where we have the opportunity too in municipal level government and county level government to think about how we create support systems for people who are in truly affordable housing. Are there questions that we should be asking about property taxes? Are there ways that we can be structuring support to keep people in those homes and to keep them affordable over a long period of time? I know Salt Lake City's invested in some models that are in that vein, and I think we could be doing that on a statewide level. It would create a lot of stability and also address some of the economic strains that we see in places like Milford that have, a large agricultural community, people that come into the community to work and simply can't find housing. So it's an issue that looks different across the entire state, but it is an issue across this entire state.
I think that, can I jump in really quick? I think that's a really important point, especially looking at it from a state level perspective as a state legislator. I represent Salt Lake City. It's the densest, most urban district in the state. But, when we're talking about crafting policy for the state of Utah, I'm always trying to think about the impact beyond just my own district. And, looking to rural Utah, that affordable housing is just as important in, Milford and Wayne County and elsewhere as it is in Salt Lake City. Folks living in the rural part of our state are oftentimes spending more than 30 to 35% of their income on housing. As people are moving away from urban centers and to rural parts of Utah, you're seeing an influx of housing costs just because we have limited supply. It's driving up the cost of living for people, especially renters. And so the affordable housing conversation mustn't be focused primarily on the urban districts and along the Wasatch Front, because this is a statewide issue. And I will also acknowledge that, I like to think of affordable housing as the broad umbrella term here. And underneath that, you have things like workforce housing. You have things like permanent supportive housing, right? You have homeless shelters as well, which is a form of housing, temporary, but housing nonetheless. You have all of these different kinds of housing underneath the broader term of affordability. And everybody in our community, whether you're, at the high 1% end, or, the rest of us, we all deserve to live in a house. We all deserve to have comfortable, stable living conditions. And so housing truly is a human right. And if we're thinking about it in those terms, then this is a community-wide issue, not just something that's for people who are living in the rough or exiting homelessness or are otherwise at the lower end of our socioeconomic spectrum. This is something that impacts our whole community. And so I think it's really valuable for us, as we're trying to build political capital to make moves at a state level, that we have to relate housing as human rights and as something that impacts all communities.
Okay. Hey, we're getting a few questions on Facebook, and I don't think we have time to ask them all. One question that was asked is where the money that was cut from housing at the legislature went, who got it, and the answer is we're in a recession, and so the money was just cut. It wasn't, and that's why Crossroads wanted to begin this series of conversations, because the default during a recession, you cut back on everything you can because sales tax revenue is down, property tax revenue is down, income tax goes down, and so you have to figure out how to balance the budget, and housing funding is one of the things that often gets cut, and that means that our long-term issues of homelessness and housing and affordability get put off for years. And so part of why we've been talking about, the reason we're talking about using things like land, using things like bonding to promote and encourage the development of affordable housing now is that we didn't do those things during the recession that began in 2009, and we're paying a price for that inaction now. And we don't want to be 10 years out from now saying, wow, there are people camping on, on every block in Salt Lake County and Weber County and Davis County. We want to actually be able to say, no, we were proactive back in 2020 and we moved forward, we made progress. I think it's absolutely true that when you look at what's happening with homelessness, there is a statewide problem. It is a statewide issue, and I think what drove it was that for during the years following that 2009 recession, wages went up half as fast as rents. And so the price of housing was going up twice as fast as people's income was going up. And now that we're entering another period of recession, probably wages are gonna go back to not rising. But rents will continue to go up if we don't find ways to increase the stock of affordable housing. So I think this was scheduled to be from 11 to 11:45. I promised the panelists that they would that we would be done in 45 minutes. So I want to thank them because we're almost out of time. We will gather all the questions on Facebook and send them to panelists and try to respond to people's specific questions that didn't get asked today. I was thinking for our last thing, we have a dance-off. Well, actually, what I'll do is I'll give each of you a chance to say, is there anything else you'd like to add? What would you, can Salt Lake, all right, I'll ask the last question. Can we find a way to build like a model supportive housing unit project for families with kids during the next 5 years?
I'm in. Yes, I will do what I can and what's in my power to do it. I would just also like to add that I think this is I know that many of these intersecting issues can feel sort of distant or divorced for people, but I know that they're very personal for me. I know they're quite personal for Senator Kitchen. I'm sure it's personal for Councilmember Wharton as well, but I, came from a family with a father that struggled with addiction, spent time in a shelter, sought, stability and treatment his much of his life that I was connected to him. And I also know that when I think about the stability that I did have in my life, it was because my mom was able to afford a home and keep us in it. And a lot of the opportunities that I've had going to college, buying my own first home, all of those came from the investment that she was able to make and hold on to in that house. So I know personally how important this issue is. It's been transformative in my life. And I think that we have to have that, not that everyone needs that personal connection to get it, but it is personal to me. And I know that it is for others as well.
I'll just say that that yes, of course, I also am committed. And you can look at what Salt Lake City's done and see that I think everybody at the city level is every elected official. I talk to Shireen about this a lot, but Salt Lake City invests more money in affordable housing dollars than any other government entity in the state of Utah, including the state of Utah. And that's not a per capita percentage. That's not that is dollar for dollar. We spend more money in Salt Lake City with our $1 billion total budget than the state of Utah does with their, I don't know what the total state budget is.
20 billion.
20 billion. And we still spend more dollars every year on affordable housing. And that obviously has to change. Salt Lake City cannot solve the housing crisis for the entire state of Utah. Salt Lake City cannot solve the crisis for unsheltered residents for the entire state of Utah. But that is the expectation that has existed for so long. Before the pandemic, Salt Lake City, we had a record number of apartment units that were being developed from 2014 right up until the end of the pandemic, the start of the pandemic. More than 27,000 units, while vacancy rates remain low and rental rates increased above 5%. Many of the new apartment communities targeting the high-end apartment market have some of the highest average rents in the country. So the demand for high-end apartment communities has also driven up rental prices and has reduced affordability in the region. So we can't just assume that because we continue to build housing stock that means that it's going to naturally, like the market is going to naturally provide affordable housing. Yes, the market that does help. I mean, having housing stock helps overall, but you have to have these policies in place at the local and at the state level that are kind of pushing into the area of affordability with the overall housing stock that we have. So, but yes, you can count on Salt Lake City to continue to lead on this issue. We've invested in it for decades, and we're not going anywhere. I actually meant that in a positive way. It kind of sounded like we've invested for decades and we're not going anywhere. What I mean is our commitment is not going anywhere.
Well, and I think actually, I mean, this has been a very Salt Lake County focused discussion, but I think that Salt Lake City has been an innovator, and if Salt Lake County were to do some of the same things, it would be easier to go to the state and say, hey, look at us. The city, Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, we both identified properties that can be used to promote housing affordability. Why can't the state do the same? Why can't you, do bonding? Why can't, I think it's easier to lead when you're doing something, right? I mean, if it's, you're not a leader if nobody follows you, but you can't lead until you do something yourself. And I think it's, and so I think this is a really good, this is a good conversation. I'm really grateful to all three of you for participating. Representative Sandra Hollins was also going to participate, but she had a conflict at the last minute. And so we appreciate her willingness to participate, even if she was unable to do so. Crossroads Urban Center is going to be doing discussions like this one every Wednesday at 11 for the next 3 weeks. Our one next week is going to feature experts on specific types of housing stock that are needed. I think our goal this week was to talk about, hey, it's still possible to do stuff about housing. I think next week we're going to talk about specific types of housing that are needed, because I think it will be easier. I mean, one thing I've observed watching legislators is that talk about this, increasing state funding and state commitment is that they don't understand. I think the conversation has been too abstract for them. I mean, you talk about we need 46,000 units, and that sounds like a giant problem. If you say we need to build this one project for homeless families with kids, or we need to build a senior project for, because there's more baby boomers that can't afford the rent anymore now that they're in retirement. I mean, I think like the more specific we can make that conversation, the easier it's going to be to convince people that it's a conversation worth being a part of and it's something worth joining in on. And so this week was saying, hey, there's options. We can do stuff. And then next week we're hoping to talk about some specific things that need to be done.
Can I just maybe mention one thing? I want to just say, sorry about my unstable internet connection, but thank you to Bill and Crossroads for focusing on these conversations. And what you have here are three individuals that work in a legislative capacity. So our focus is on policy and budget. And what you've heard from us is that there's an interest on the legislative side to make real meaningful impact on housing. As a constituent of, as a resident of the state of Utah, and we have a big governor's race this year, it would be huge for me and for all of us tuned in today to hear from the candidates. Maybe there's an opportunity for Chris Peterson and Spencer Cox to come in and talk about this, because no matter who becomes the governor, and no matter what the legislature does, we need to have executive leadership on this as well, because it goes hand in glove. And so I would love to hear from our governor, gubernatorial candidates, and hopefully maybe they will agree to come on here, to do a Zoom call with you and have the same kind of conversation, because I'd love to hear from them as well.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. We need really clear leadership at the executive branch, and I think we have it in the city, we have it in the county, and I'm hopeful that we can that the next whoever wins will have leadership at the state level in the executive branch. That's a great place to end.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.